it is heartening in some ways that there are politicians out there that don't just toe the company line, that have the courage and temerity to, in essence, question the event, as many of us do, and call for answers. And to this day, once again, all of the controversy could very quickly go away if the powers that be did in fact secede to that request and open a coronial inquest. Welcome to the Wasp Files. Some of this material may be distressing and viewer discretion is advised. This episode of the Wasp Files explores the inextricable link between politicians and the Port Arthur Massacre. And before everyone starts going boo hiss, you may be surprised to learn that there are quite a number of politicians and elected members of Parliament that have questioned the mainstream narrative in relation to the tragedy, even going so far as to call for a royal commission into the Port Arthur Massacre. But of course, the machine goes into overdrive when it comes to anyone questioning the mainstream narrative that's been punched out by the media and our so-called trusted leaders and politicians. And very quickly, a lot of these politicians have to backpedal or find themselves with vitriolic ridicule in the mainstream press. The first of these, which a lot of people were probably aware of, was when the international news reporting agency Al Jazeera did their hijack hatchet job on One Nation by secretly filming a meeting with Pauline Hanson and some of her members of her party and an Al Jazeera reporter, Roger Muller. So they were having just basically a conversational discussion in, I think it was a licensed environment, and of course were unaware that they were being filmed. And at that point there was a discussion about the Port Arthur Massacre, and Pauline Hanson quite reasonably raised some questions. She quoted the former New South Wales Premier Barry Unsworth's famous quote that there will never be uniform gun laws in Australia until there's a massacre in Tasmania, which is factual. And then said that there were a lot of questions about Port Arthur.
It would actually take a massacre in Tasmania to change the gun laws in France.
Wow.
Haven't you heard that?
I hadn't heard that one.
Have a look at it. It was set up
Going
the
all
Parliament.
No, it's that whole September 11 thing too, you know.
Those shots, they were precision shots to the number out. I've read the book on it, Port Arthur.
Yeah.
Fine questions there.
So straight away, once footage of this, in my opinion, unethical recording of Pauline Hanson and her party had hit the mainstream airwaves, then the critique and ridicule of her was vitriolic in the extreme. This was followed on by some other very well-known and well-spoken, in some cases outspoken politicians. Former New South Wales Senator for the Liberal Democratic Party, David Linehelm, was also fairly outspoken on questioning the Port Arthur Massacre, and he had posted an article on the party webpage which was saying that although the government of the day had lauded themselves on solving gun problems with the bans that came immediately after the Port Arthur Massacre, that was not the case, and that David Linehelm put forward some fairly strong arguments, logically and reasonably, that the gun ban in Port Arthur didn't affect gun crime in Australia as much as it was lauded to have done so. Surprisingly also, there was another candidate for the Greens Party by the name of David Paul, who had come out in the press and stated that he didn't believe that Martin Bryant was the shooter at Port Arthur Massacre, and the backlash from that was that he was removed from the party or asked to step down. Just recently I had some very vigorous conversations and in some ways assisted a federal candidate who was initially running for the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party in the seat of Tasmania before resigning from that party and becoming an independent for Tasmania. And he had contacted me in relation to the Wasp Files and our investigations into the massacre. And we had some conversations, and I was assisting him for a while because one of his policies was to call for a coronial inquest into the Port Arthur Massacre to help put the controversy to rest. And I remember cautioning him at the time, saying, as a standing member of the SFFP and being a Tasmanian candidate, that he was literally putting his head in the lion's mouth. But a press release was drafted in which he was calling for a coronial inquest.
We need a royal commission into the Port Arthur Massacre. There are people in Tasmania that have had family involved in that and they want answers. If you look at the Wasp Files, the interviews he's done with people who were there at that massacre and their views on the situation, they're pretty much saying the same thing. We've got to have a royal commission into it. Let's just get it sorted and find out what really happened.
The Port Arthur Massacre evidence has been sealed for 75 years. Any thoughts why the government isn't being transparent about the event?
Why would you seal those files? Why is it that the Commissioner of Police in Tasmania is the only one that has access to those files? There are so many questions and so many unanswered conspiracies that need to be addressed. Now, if we have a royal commission, then we can lay everything to rest. One of the most tragic events in Australia, if not the world, hasn't been answered for. There has been no trial, no judgment. I personally don't believe that any of the information adds up because we don't have the full story, and a lot of people that I've spoken to are the same. You've got to really wonder why they would seal the files. That's the biggest thing that makes everyone question everything. We really need to get the information out there, put an end to it.
Why do you think it was sealed for 75 years? Why would they seal that evidence? What are we missing here?
Well, the biggest thing that people say to me when I ask them the same question, because everyone will be dead by then that was involved with it. The fact that the commissioner is going to be the only one to be able to see it, that means that no one's going to know anything. Martin Bryant sitting in Brisbane prison, no one's allowed to talk to him. Sealing something for 75 years, I think that they did it because pretty much everyone will be gone.
And there was quite a number of questions that were posed in the local publication there, which was the Tasmanian Times, which were questions that he felt needed to be answered in relation to the Port Arthur Massacre. This incurred, most of the vitriolic response came from the Tasmanian Times editor themselves, who took it upon themselves to censor that article. However, they did at least print his press release and the questions that followed on from that. This candidate, whose name is Philip Bigg, is running as an independent candidate in Tasmania and is one of those few politicians that has the guts to call for a coronial inquest into the Port Arthur Massacre. Just recently, following on from the furor, particularly in the press, after the Bondi Beach terrorist attacks, there was, of course, a lot of mention in comparison to the Port Arthur Massacre and the correlation, if you like, between the fact that they were both major gun crimes involving illegal use of firearms. But many of the politicians have rightly spoken out in Parliament condemning the Albanese government's moves to heavily restrict firearms even further for law-abiding firearm owners in the wake of that tragedy, and instead should be focusing on the illegal activities of terrorists in the making and, of course, criminals. One of these was a standing member of the One Nation Party, Malcolm Roberts, who courageously got up in Parliament and was referencing the Port Arthur Massacre, and then went as far as to say that John Howard, the former Prime Minister at the time who had initiated the firearms bans after Port Arthur, Malcolm Roberts had stated that John Howard had illegally shut down the coronial inquest into the Port Arthur Massacre.
Now, I divert briefly from Bondi to Australia's largest domestic mass murder, the Port Arthur Massacre, killing 35 people in beautiful Tasmania on the 28th of April 1996, because there's an important lesson, at least one important lesson. The then Prime Minister John Howard illegally cancelled the request into the 35 deaths, an action that failed and betrayed the victims and their families, betrayed every Australian. Had the lessons of Port Arthur been explored through a royal commission or through an inquest, a proper inquest, we may not be where we are today. Our obligation lies not only to those Australians in mourning for what this country has lost in the last month, our obligation goes to those Australians yet to be born. It may take many years for the circumstances of Bondi to recur. yet they will recur unless action is taken now. Prime Ministers are elected in a vote of the party caucus. Leaders, though, are not appointed. They are self-emergent as a result of their successful, sincere and honest handling of challenges and incidents that affect the people they supposedly lead. On Sunday, 21st of December, at Bondi's Light Over Darkness Vigil, at the memorial to terrorist attack victims, the current Prime Minister was loudly and emphatically booed. That booing reverberated across Australia. It was an emblematic verdict from the people on the Prime Minister's performance in response to Bondi. Because in Bondi's aftermath, our country has not seen leadership. Once the absence of leadership became obvious and open, the government tried to rehabilitate a tarnished image with branding. Branding, though, is not leadership. It is dangerous because it's a vacuum. The best way to honour the Bondi Massacre victims is to respect them, to be honest, to be open, to enable the Fair Dinkum Royal Commission to get the data and facts truthfully, and then, based on the data and facts, to change systems and adjust leadership behaviours.
Speaking of John Howard, former Prime Minister John Howard, who was instrumental in initiating the extreme firearm reforms after the Port Arthur Massacre, would of course be the big enchilada if he was available to be interviewed on the Wasp Files. And I have had many people request that I try and contact him to see if he will agree to interview. And that's exactly what I did. So I have reached out to the Secretary of former Prime Minister John Howard with a formal request for him to be interviewed on the Wasp Files. I was told at the time that he was travelling overseas and they would get back to me with a response, and I did receive one about a month later, which was in essence a formal reply from the Secretary of Mr Howard, stating that he had politely declined to be interviewed on the Wasp Files and that his views on Port Arthur were well known. But I did try, and of course many people in the comments on the Wasp Files point their fingers squarely at John Howard as being, if not behind the Port Arthur Massacre, but certainly pivotal in being involved in the subsequent gun reforms which had been drafted as early as 1991. But in terms of his premeditated knowledge and or involvement or orchestration of the Port Arthur Massacre, well, that's yet to be determined. John Howard had only been in the position for basically about 2 months before Port Arthur, before that tragedy landed on his desk. However, in terms of the pre-knowledge and planning in relation to firearms restrictions, that, as stated, had occurred as early as 1991, and there are draft papers with that information available. So one day, Prime Minister John Howard would of course be a good person to speak to, but his opinions are very well known. It is heartening in some ways that there are politicians out there that don't just toe the company line, that have the courage and temerity to, in essence, question the event, as many of us do, and call for answers. And to this day, once again, all of the controversy could very quickly go away if the powers that be did in fact secede to that request and open a coronial inquest. There is no time constraint on a coronial inquest, or in many ways the number of coronial inquests you can have. A criminal event can initiate a coronial inquest, and then many years later new information can come to light that would then necessitate a second coronial inquest. So in calling for one, I believe that's why we should never really give up trying to find answers to the questions. And certainly if some politicians are brave enough to follow that path, that may open a possible door to a coronial inquest. Of course, if further evidence comes to light, and I'm certainly vigorous in pursuing that, that may even go further to providing what is known as fresh and compelling evidence that would then mandate a coronial inquest or a reinvestigation of the Port Arthur Massacre. So personally, I would like to reach out and thank those politicians that have spoken up and of course face the typical demonisation and backlash that comes from the mainstream media. because those politicians are truthful, courageous, and are at least willing to look at the other side of the story and question the event, as we all should do. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Wasp Files. New episodes will be uploaded every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Feel free to share far and wide, and please see the links to the Dropbox files and information relating to the episodes. Also, without any obligation, please see the Buy Me a Coffee campaign, which helps keep the channel running and also provides profits to my friends who are survivors from Port Arthur who have supported me on this journey. Thank you.